2 years ago, I had the privilege of speaking with Laurie Adami for the first time on the show. Laurie isn't your typical guest. She's a cancer survivor, she's a patient advocate, and she's somebody that lived through over 12 years of treatment, including CAR T therapy, which ultimately saved her life. That episode is still one of the most listened to episodes we've had, but this conversation goes a bit deeper. She's back 2 years on. She's now considered cured. She's written a memoir about her journey. She's continued to work closely with patients and the wider biotech industry. Yet many of the challenges we spoke about last time still exist. So in this episode, we talk about the reality of life after CAR T, what's changed in the industry, what hasn't changed, and why access to life-saving therapies is still one of the biggest challenges facing patients today. So this is a really honest, powerful conversation, and one that I think everyone working in this space needs to hear. So hope you enjoy the show. Hi, Laurie. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, Anish. Good to see you again. It's been a couple of years.
Exactly. Great to see you. I think we met about 3 years ago in Miami at the Facilitate conference. I think it was when we first met. And at that point, you'd been through a 12-year cancer journey by that point, and you told me your story. You'd had 7 lines of therapy, I think it was at the time, multiple relapse clinical trials, and ultimately CAR T, which saved your life. So I'm very excited to have you back on the show, and excited to hear what you've been up to in the last 2 years. So a couple of years on, let's start there. How are you today? How does life actually feel like now compared to where you were back then?
Well, I'm doing great. I am now, and obviously another 2 years out, it's still in a complete remission. And this July 16th, I will be 8 years since my CAR T and considered now by my oncologist to be cured. My life is very busy working on trying to keep myself well, writing my memoir, as well as continuing to do a lot of patient advocacy and legislative advocacy for some different nonprofits. And so I have been good. And I did want to share that Kite Pharmaceutical released the long-term study results from the clinical trial I was in of Yescarta back in 2018. And of the 140 some odd follicular patients that were in the trial along with me, nearly 2/3 of us have required no additional treatment. And that's a pretty astonishing number when you look at the alternative treatments. So all is good. My son is now 26. He just turned 26 last
Wow.
week,
Okay.
and he's doing well. So life is good.
Brilliant. Well, look, we're gonna talk about a few things that that you've been focusing on in the last 2 or 3 years since we last spoke. I suppose just before we get into that, you've been, when people hear that you're cured in your world, what does that, like, what do they misunderstand about what the reality of life is after CAR T?
Right. Well, so people think, well, you're done with cancer. Everything's great, right? But there's very little understanding of the fact that a patient, for example, me, went through 12 years of treatment, continual failed treatment, and every one of those treatments had side effects. And those are side effects, unfortunately, that I'm still living with. And I think there's a lack of understanding with people. Well, you're done with cancer, go on, live your life. But I have a number of issues that I continue to deal with. And as well as I am now considered a long-term survivor. So I was diagnosed 20 years ago, April 14th, which that year in 2006 was Good Friday. So 20 years out, which is terrific, but there are still issues I deal with because of the chemotherapy that I had, because of the radioimmunotherapy, because of some of these treatments I had. And not really nothing from the CAR T. And, that's one of the beauties of CAR T is that, we don't know long-term. There's not enough history, right? I'm out 8 years. Emily Whitehead is out 14 years. So there are those people, but we don't know long term. Will there be issues because of CAR T? But all I know is it saved my life. And without doing CAR T when I did it, I was dead. So I kind of can't really, concern myself too much with that. I just will have to hope if something happens because of the CAR T, there will be medical progress and we'll deal with it. I wish there were more remedies for the long-term side effects that I have. For example, I was on steroids as a big part of all of my treatments, not CAR T, of course, but everything that came before. So I was on steroids for 12 years. So my bones are terrible. And I developed avascular necrosis and had to have a hip replacement. And where's the progress to grow our bones? The remedies that are out there right now are not particularly effective, and
Yeah.
they carry also risk, cancer risks and whatnot.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So how does
so it's
that
a,
affect day-to-day life then? How do side effects affect your day-to-day life?
so I have to be very careful because, and in the fall of 2025, I don't think you and I spoke, but I took a fall. I was out walking and I took a fall and I fractured 5 bones. And, I didn't have to have surgery. I was fortunate, but I had to do 2-week inpatient rehab, real intensive rehab to get back in shape. So, there are definitely things I can't do anymore. My son just told me, Mom, no more ice skating. I've always been an ice skater. And he said, no more, because if I fall, I can do a lot of damage. So I definitely have had to slow down, and so I'm feeling that, result. And I know we all slow down as we age anyway, or not everybody, but most of us. So I'm much more conscious, of those issues. I have a hearing loss. I've lost a lot of hearing from the chemotherapy, in particular in my right ear. And I've been seeing different audiologists and going to different centers. I've tried hearing aids. They don't really fully address the issue. Again, how come we haven't made more progress on, figuring out how to restore hearing loss? It just seems like some of these issues sitting here in 2026, it's disappointing we're not further along. But I know they're also not simple issues to solve, obviously.
Yeah, I mean they're huge challenges, aren't they, in the bigger picture. So you've now spent the last several years now speaking to pharma and biotech companies about your journey, about CAR T, and about and being a patient advocate. I suppose. What do you think? Is there anything that frustrates you about the industry in terms of is there something that the industry still doesn't really fully understand about patients?
Oh, yeah, big time. And I was just down in San Diego a couple weeks ago. I spoke at a biotech meeting that Morrison Forster sponsored. They do intellectual property law, patent law, and there were something like 150 attendees there. A lot of biotech founders, academicians, practitioners, researchers, et cetera. So a big audience. I did the keynote speech, and I was again struck, as I was in Miami when you and I first met, by how little industry has a sense of what a patient experiences. And, again, I got the comments, I've never heard a patient speak before. Wow, I had no idea. And so there's still a disconnect.
What is
And
that?
industry likes to say it's because of HIPAA. They can't talk to patients because of HIPAA. And I always say, well, if I'm willing to talk to you, HIPAA protects me. And I think patients can be trouble. Patients can complain. So I think there's been this disconnect between pharma, biotech, and patient. And in the middle is the physician. So the oncologist. So in my case, so I did 3 clinical trials as part of that 12-year journey I had. And I never interacted with the sponsor, the biotech or the pharma company. It went through my doctor, which was very frustrating because I was clearly having issues on some of these therapies that the doctor would say to the pharma company, she's having this side effect. And the pharma would say, well, that's not our drug. And so the oncologist has to play that role in between. and there's a disconnect. And it's really frustrating. And I just kind of roll my eyes when I see an ad, or, I read a piece on the internet, whatever, that, oh, we're patient centric, from these pharma companies. It's lip service. They think by saying that they can improve their standing with the patient community, but nothing has really changed. This has been true when I was diagnosed 20 years ago, and it's still true today. So that is still a big frustration point, as well as there's still very little awareness of CAR T
Yeah.
in the public, in the patient, in the general population. It's no different. I was in the hospital. I was in London actually speaking last year, and I ended up in the ER because I had this abdominal pain, and it ended up I had a kidney infection. So I was at St. Mary's Hospital in London, where they actually discovered penicillin, which I thought was very cool. But I was seeing all these doctors, and nobody had heard of CAR T.
Yeah.
And that's true in the United States as well. I can even go into UCLA and see a non-cancer nurse, doctor, whatever, and they don't have familiarity with it. I always say I could stop, and I said this 2 weeks ago in San Diego, I could stop 20 people on Wall Street or 20 people on any main street in the United States, and I could say, what is CAR T? 19 of them would think it's the new Tesla model, the CAR T, right? Nobody's heard of it. And I think all these pharma companies, obviously they're competing with each other for market share, but they're forgetting if patients don't know about it, they're not going to ask their oncologists to get it.
Yeah.
And also too, these doctors don't have experience with it.
Yeah.
80% of patients in the United States are diagnosed in community hospital and community oncology settings. And these doctors don't know about CAR T. So there's still this number that 80% of patients in the US who qualify for CAR T cannot get it.
When companies say patient centricity, from your perspective, what should that actually look like?
That should look like they're actually having conversations with patients when they're designing clinical trials to understand the challenges the patients have. They create these requirements without an understanding of how a patient can possibly be able to do this sort of thing. And there's no patient representation at the table. And I was on an FDA panel a couple of years ago. There's an initiative that Congress every year funds rare cancer research. And so I sat on the panel for blood cancers, and they had a researcher go in there talking about, oh, this trial, this new agent is great. And so what are the requirements of the patients in this clinical trial? And they were going to require a weekly biopsy from a patient. They didn't understand, like, a patient can't do that. Like, they just have no understanding. And the reality, Hamish, is that if you have never had cancer, you have no idea what it is to have cancer, and all the stuff you have to navigate, your life, your financial challenges. These companies don't understand that at all.
Where do
You
you
know,
think the disconnect, like what's the reason for this disconnect? And I suppose what's the, not necessarily the reason you've answered that, but what are the consequences of this disconnect?
patients aren't getting what they need. Patients can't access these treatments. In the United States, there's this thing called the K economy. I don't know
Yeah.
if you've heard that term,
Yeah.
where the letter K, people on that upward sloped K are doing great. People on the lower K are not. The same can be said for our health insurance system in the United States. So people on the upward slope who have original Medicare or who have a preferred provider organization insurance plan are usually going to be okay. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, because I was on the upper K and it wasn't easy at all. But then you have all the people on the lower K who have what's called HMOs, health maintenance organizations, or they have Medicare Advantage, where they have a finite network of doctors they can see, and they can't, if they want to go outside the network, they have to pay out of pocket. And a consult could be $500 or $1,000. So most people can't afford it. So there's this problem with access, and there's this problem also in the United States with the community oncology, community hospital setting, where patients are often treated by general oncologists. And those general oncologists are treating solid tumors and liquid tumors. There have been hundreds of approvals in the last 20 years of new therapies, many of them immunotherapies, oral medications, CAR T, bispecific antibodies, etc. Those oncologists don't know about it. And they've been doing chemo, they've been doing radiation since the mid 20th century. And that's what they know. So when a patient comes in, well, we've been doing our CHOP for, CHOP since the 60s, our CHOP since the 90s, and that's what they'll do for treatment, even though that's not indicated anymore as a first-line treatment for many types of lymphoma, such as the one I have, which was follicular. When I was diagnosed 20 years ago, that was all there was, R-CHOP. And
Yeah.
that's what I had to get. And then it didn't work. So then I had to go searching high and low to find trials. So I think it's a whole combination of things that are putting pressure on the system, and it's just getting worse.
Yeah.
The Affordable Care Act, the premium relief, the subsidies that were put in place have now been eliminated. So people are having to drop insurance. It's just worse.
Yeah. Where do you think, if you had to pin sort of one particular bottleneck for CAR T, where do you think the biggest bottleneck is? Is it awareness? Is it insurance? Is it infrastructure, or is it something
It's
else?
awareness, it's insurance. Those are the two big things. And I think if awareness were greater and patients realized how superior this treatment is in terms of overall response rates, lack of side effects, the one and done notion of it,
Yeah.
patients would be pounding on their doctors to figure out how to get it. And that would likely mean those oncologists at those community settings would have to refer their patient out. And as sad as it is, doctors don't want to do that. And I've had patients say, well, they just want to give me chemo and they can do it locally. And I say, yeah, but chemo is not as effective. Chemo oftentimes is a Band-Aid, not the cure, that CAR T has the potential to be. And CAR T is one and done. All these chemos, long-term side effects. Band-Aids, then you have to go find something else.
Well, you're living proof of that. Your
Right.
side effects now are not from the CAR T; they're from your previous rounds of chemo. What so ultimately, who owns this problem? There's so many stakeholders involved in all of this.
Well, gee, weren't we supposed to have a replacement plan for the Affordable Care Act? Nothing's happened, and it's just getting worse for patients. And the ownership is with our Congress, with our leadership, for not addressing this problem, for sticking their head in the sand, because they all have good health insurance.
Yeah,
None of this impacts them.
yeah. If nothing changes in the next 5 to 10 years, what does that mean for patients?
Everything is already getting more expensive. Even insurance, I'm sorry, even company provided insurance. So when you go work for a company, they will provide you with options for your health care, typically, if they're a big enough size company, and then you can choose, do you want an HMO, do you want a PPO, and then the premiums will vary. Well, now, even for PPOs, the coverage is getting worse. Deductibles are increasing. The amount of coverage is being reduced. And half of patients in the United States that go through cancer end up with medical debt. And this is just getting worse. But, they don't care. Honestly, I mean, I live this because I'm talking to these patients all the time. I'm supporting a patient now. Her income is $1,100 a month. And she's saying, I can't afford this out of pocket. So there's Band-Aids now to the system. Blood Cancer United, which just rebranded from Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, has just introduced a debt navigation service where they have debt counselors that will help you try to reduce your medical debt from your cancer treatment, from everything that goes along with it. They've already relieved something like $10 million in debt, but that's pennies. I mean, 50% of patients have medical debt coming out the other end of cancer. I don't know the statistics for how many go bankrupt, have to declare bankruptcy. But all these treatments are so expensive. And, everybody says, oh, CAR T is so expensive. Well, I'm sorry, everything is expensive. We have small molecule drugs now. We have BTK inhibitors. We have PI3 kinase inhibitors. We have HDAC. We have all these different inhibitors. They're $200,000 a year. That's what insurance gets billed. And they're billed for most patients, they're billed to the pharmacy benefit. So patients can have out of pocket of between $2,000 and $4,000 a month. If your income is $1,100 a month, you can't afford that. So there's just a general lack of awareness of all these issues, unless you're living it or you're like me. I'm talking to patients all the time who are dealing with it.
Thank you for sharing all that. So,
Boy, I'm sorry to be so doom and gloom.
well, no, so
There are
look,
good
you're
things
painting.
happening.
Well, let's talk about that because you're right. Like it is, there are so many challenges, but it isn't all doom and gloom. What are some of the areas where you feel there's been real progress made?
So first of all, looking at CAR T, there are new indications now that they're using CAR T for. So I think when we spoke, they were starting to get solutions out for multiple myeloma. Now there are more options for multiple myeloma. There are now the use of CAR Ts for lymphomas that have metastasized to the brain. Used to be if you had any brain involvement, you couldn't get CAR T. There are now many, many trials going on for autoimmune disease. So I've actually met the first patient who got it for MS in the States, as well as lupus. There's now a new cell and gene therapy, relatively new in the last couple of years, for sickle cell anemia, which is just an awful, awful disease. And I met the first patient there, Victoria, who's doing her, thing to raise awareness of that. They're getting close to in-human trials of CAR T for solid tumors. So they're working on pancreatic. There are trials for glioblastoma. I recently supported a patient who got CAR T for glioblastoma. Unfortunately, it didn't work and she passed away. But this is kind of earlier stage in human. They're working on multiple targets for CAR Ts. So some of the sense of it is that, like for multiple myeloma, CAR T appears to be very effective, but the durability hasn't been there. So perhaps the integration of additional targets, new CDs or new enzymes they can target, will increase the durability of those CAR Ts. So all of that is good, and I'm hearing about all kinds of, I spoke at AstraZeneca last fall and, was recently on their trial page looking at all the different indications they're working on for CAR T. So there's a lot of good stuff happening. There's been a slowdown because unfortunately the government cut research last year, which impacted not only the NIH, but all these academically, all these funded universities where all this stuff came out of. So I know patients that were impacted, patients that were supposed to be in trials, that the trials were shut down. Again, lives were lost. Nobody seems to care. But the other thing that's happened is there's been such progress made on side effect management for CAR T, such that many, I'm not sure it's most yet, but many patients now do CAR T outpatient. And that is a huge cost saver for insurance, for everyone. Because the cost of a hotel room is a lot more than the cost of an apartment or, a facility on campus, say at UCLA, and then the quality of life for the patient is much better because you're not in that hospital setting being woken up all night long. So that's good. There's also been progress. There are new companies now that are working on batch moding CAR T production. There's a company I visited up in San Francisco that produces multiple batches at a time, and There's no human interaction. Right now, the production of CAR T cells is very labor intensive, not only on the manufacturing, but on the quality control side. Well, there are companies out that are looking to automate that and using AI to do that, where the cells go in one end of the machine as the raw cells and they come out the other end. There's also been improvement in delivery speed. So trying to reduce the number of days it takes to turn around a patient's CAR T cells. So there's been progress on those fronts. So there's a lot of good stuff happening. There's a lot of work now going on for in vivo CAR T, where rather than remove the patient's T cells, send them out to be manufactured, the patient would be injected with certain materials that would create the CAR T cells within their body. And that would eliminate the manufacturing time, obviously, speed up to the delivery to patients, allow for much broader use. Clearly, if you could just inject patients with something that would create CAR T cells in their body, you don't have to go necessarily to a specialized facility or have your
Yeah,
patient's
yeah,
CAR T cells manufactured off site. That could do a lot to enhance productivity, and throughput. And there's still work going on in the allogeneic space, trying to create off the shelf CAR T cells. I think that hasn't yet proven to be um, viable at this point, but again, it's early, so we'll
yeah.
see.
You touched on their AI and automation, and the one of the biggest challenges has been infrastructure for companies when they start getting to manufacturing capacity and all of that sort of stuff. Where does I suppose what does the blueprint look like for a cell therapy or cell and gene therapy company now,
Yeah.
taking that sort of that challenge around scalability?
Well, I think it's early, right? So we don't really know. We don't really understand the benefits yet. I think we know the risks of what can happen. It's no different than it ever was. You have garbage in, you're going to have garbage out. Right? So, to the extent that garbage is getting loaded in, so there has to be smart AI. I don't think that AI on itself, is necessarily going to be the be all and end all. And we know how it can be abused. But I think to the extent they're trying to use it in order to enhance production and speed throughput, that's got to be part of the solution as to how to get more patients to get to this life-saving therapy. And when you look at autoimmune disease, very different than blood cancer. Blood cancers on their own are usually rare diseases. Autoimmune is not. So there's a huge market. So they're going to have to overcome the issues of scalability if that's going to succeed in that
Yeah.
space.
Do you think the industry's ready to expand into those areas like autoimmune?
I think the science, I think the science is proven. Again, I think it's going to come to scalability and how much efficiency they can get into the process of generating the cells. And, it's a little different than like a very aggressive cancer tumor where if you have to wait a month to get your CAR T cells back and you have a super aggressive lymphoma like Burkitt's lymphoma or diffuse large B cell lymphoma, you can't wait. So those tumors can double in a week. So then they double again. You're looking at, huge growth. And so right now, what patients have to do, I'm talking to a patient right now who's getting radiation to try to bridge her to be able to wait till her CAR T cells come back. And again, getting radiation has the potential to cause side effects for the patient down the road. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough. I'm not a scientist, but I've always been very optimistic about the ability of science to figure things out. I look at when I started in the software business and our models were so complex that we could only do the calculations on mainframe computers. There were no PCs that could do that. And then slowly, as chips got smarter and we learned, we were then able to port our software down and do millions of calculations on a PC using a standard computational chip. So I'm always the optimist that scientists, and there are enough well-intentioned scientists and enough well-intentioned people within academia and within the pharma company that they're going to figure out how to do this.
Let's talk about your book. You've written a memoir about your journey. Why did you decide to write a book, and who is it? Who is it for?
So I've been writing really for 20 years since my diagnosis because I've been writing for my friends and family as a way to keep them updated on what's been happening. And so I was doing a weekly email, which started out with 10 friends and family and grew to be 200 and something friends and family. And that was a way to keep people informed. So I didn't have to answer tons of telephone calls and tons of emails. And then right before I did CAR-T, I started a Caring Bridge blog to share my experience through that CAR-T process. And so I always have had the interest, ever since I was young, I wanted to write a book. It was
Okay. Yeah.
girls used to play with dolls, right? I used to play office and author. So I would have my desk, I'd be writing my books. And so I always had this dream to do that. And then I've been advocating on behalf of other patients for almost as long as I was diagnosed. 18 or 19 years I've been working with other patients, and everybody said to me, Laurie, you're so practical. You have such good advice. You ought to write a book. So I finally did. A lot of it was things I took from the writing over the years, but the bulk of it is new material. And so I share my journey, which you might say, God, that sounds awful. 12 years, but it's a way to teach other patients and their families and their loved ones on the road behind me what you do when you get a cancer diagnosis. What are the important steps to take? How do you find support? How do you find a specialist in your disease? How do you learn about clinical trials? How do you tell your child? How do so it's a very sort of underground
Yeah.
how to, but
Yeah.
it
Right.
also incorporates all the lessons I learned about the problems with our healthcare system. So there's a fair amount in there. And, so it's really, well, it's geared to the patient, and I wrote it because of patients, because I'm hoping that a patient might have somebody give them a copy that they can learn something to make their journey better. But I also hope people in the industry read the book. And I've visited biotech companies and pharmaceutical companies who said, Laurie, as soon as you're done, we want to buy a number of books, because when we onboard an employee, we want them to read your book. And I think that would be fabulous, because I'm still struck whenever I visit pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, they've never heard a patient's story. And it gives them so much purpose to understand that what they're doing is saving lives. And it's tangible.
Yeah.
When they meet me, I'm like, I wouldn't be here. I'd be underground if it weren't for the work you're doing. And it's also, a way to, potentially raise awareness in our country about what cancer patients go through and the hurdles we go through and how it's not being addressed and it's just getting worse. So it's all kinds of things like that. And I currently have 75,000 words. When I originally was starting to write, I was told between 60 and 90,000 is usually a good length for a memoir. I think more like 80, 100 is better. So I've recently hired an editor, author, an individual who's already published and is very well connected with literary agents as well as publishing companies. So I'm going to try to get it published the old fashioned way. But, memoirs like this, you might say, been there, done that. The person I'm working with thinks this is a different take, but we'll see. So, but if not, if I'm not able to get a literary agent to get a publisher, I'm going to just self-publish. I know several other patients who self-published their memoirs, and they're able and willing to help me do it. But I think for distribution, if I can manage to get a publishing contract, that would be a good thing. But I also do know I have a pretty good following anyway. So, I have, just with all the speaking I've been doing, I've been writing a lot of articles, I've been doing a lot of podcasts. I already have, an existing audience. So we'll just see how I'm not doing this for the money. I'm doing this to try to help other patients. So It's a little hard to know right now how it's all going to pan out, but
When do you think it will be available to the public?
well, we're going to get a product out to take to literary agents by mid-May. So, to start, shopping it around, and then, we'll see. And if it's going to take a long, long time, I'm not interested. It's imperative I get this out soon because it's helpful, and I've had a number of friends and family read it, and, the feedback I've gotten has been terrific. And, I just know that this will be something that can help another patient to understand, because when you get that diagnosis, and 40% of Americans will get diagnosed with cancer in their lifetime, 40%. And now it may be when you're 86 and you're diagnosed with prostate cancer, or maybe you're 70 and you have a cancerous growth removed from your face. There's also a disturbing trend now in the United States looking at young people and the incidence of cancers. And these are organ cancers in young people. These are colon cancers, pancreatic cancers, breast cancers, cervical cancers. Some of it's related to HPV for the generation that was unable to, that did not get the HPV vaccine. But it's also, I think there's a sense that all of these things in our environment, all the toxins, I just recently read an article about small, the way plastics break down into these micro particles. And companies actually use those microparticles, for example, in toothpaste to create abrasives. And I was reading this article where it was talking about this man who went to his dentist, and dentist said, "Oh, you use this kind of toothpaste. I'm not going to say the brand name because I don't want to get a lawsuit. But, oh, I can tell you use N toothpaste, XYZ." And the patient's like, "How do you know that?" He said, "Because I can see the little particles. They're all embedded in your teeth." And we're ingesting all this stuff. So it's scary.
Just to finish things off, Laurie, and it's been great having you back on the show and hearing what you've been doing for the last couple of years since we spoke last. Your first episode is still one of the most listened to episodes that I've done. If you were to, if every biotech CEO, doctor, scientist listening to this could take away, if they could take one thing away from your story, what would you like it to be?
Look, this cell and gene therapy works. It's clear. But we need to restore funding. We need to raise awareness, and we need to figure out how to triage patients and get them to this therapy. Otherwise, the science is great, but if we don't get it to patients,
What's the point? Why does it matter so much to you?
because it saved my life. And, you know, my son has a mom, my husband has a wife, and there's so many people out there who are not going to live because they don't have options, or they have options, but they don't have awareness of those options. And so they can't get to it. And that's why, and I just having gone through 12 years of treatment after treatment after treatment, 6 of them that failed me to get to one that was one and done. I mean, it's just so clear. And everybody likes to use the argument, well, it's so expensive. Well, I'm sorry, everything before CAR T cost $3 million if I added up all the cost of everything. So that's why it matters. I think we're sitting on science that we have not figured out how to get into the population. And so people are losing lives that people shouldn't be losing their lives when there are options. And that's why I care. And because I'm talking to patients all the time, and I'm actually losing patients on a regular basis because they can't get to this. I mean, it's criminal.
Laurie, thanks again. Thanks so much for sharing your journey, and it's great to see you again. It's great to see you doing well. I know that you're still having your challenges with the side effects, but
But hey, I'm alive. I'm
you're alive. To see you
alive.
doing well is great. And we've known each other now for over 3 or coming up to 3 years. And it's gone very quickly. So we'll definitely do another one in a couple of years. We'll see how when the book's out, and hopefully you've continued doing the work, and hopefully we've made some more progress in this industry over the next 2 years. Because
Let's hope.
it has been a tough couple of years. There are challenges, but I think the work that you're doing, the industry needs to hear more of it. So, thanks so much. It's great to see you.
You're
If
welcome. Great
people
to see you too.
if people want to reach out to you, Laurie, is LinkedIn generally the best way?
Yeah, LinkedIn is great. So they can just reach out to me and message me, and even patients struggling can reach out to me that way, and I can try to help them. But yeah, through LinkedIn is really the best way. I am going to be putting up a website soon, but I have not done that yet. And when I do that, I'll put that on my LinkedIn page so people can also go there to reach out.
Well, look, yeah, we'll share all the links on, and we've got a YouTube channel now, which I didn't have last time, so it'll be on YouTube, which you can share and see it, as well as being on Apple and Spotify. So
Oh, great. Yeah, I'd like to share it on LinkedIn if you're
yeah, yeah,
okay with that, and also on my
absolutely,
blog.
yeah, no, definitely, yeah. All right, Laurie. Well, look, take care, look after yourself, and we'll speak
You
again soon.
too.
Thanks, Laurie.
Bye.